It's very important if you're using your phone for the audio connection that you turn off your computer audio. Otherwise, there might be feedback that gets through the system for everyone to hear. Audio settings in Zoom can be set by clicking the up arrow adjacent to the mute button. Also, please note the chat button near the bottom right. This will open the box in which you can ask questions. That chat could be a different place on your screen, but for what you're seeing here, that'll give you an idea. This grant writing training series is focused on writing the proposal. If you would like more information about setting up a Brownfield program or a general overview of the funding, KSU Tab has a few online resources that might help. The On Your Mark Getting Started Early webinars, which were just in April, provide an overview of applying for Brownfield's funding. The Building a Brownfield program goes into the team you'll need to assemble for a successful Brownfield program. There's also a Brownfield Basics online training program for entities planning Brownfield programs, which includes defining brownfields, identifying the steps in the Brownfield redevelopment process, and choosing appropriate strategies and tools for addressing Brownfield concerns. If you're brand new to Brownfields, you may want to check out one of these resources. My name is Scott Nightingale. I'm with the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. We provide help to communities addressing Brownfields issues. KSU Tab activities are funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, so our assistance is free to your community. I coordinate KSU Tab services for EPA Region 6, which includes Louisiana. My 3 trips to Louisiana last year were highlighted by great food and people who care about improving their communities. I look forward to coming back.
All right, thanks, Scott. My name is Rebecca Oddie. I'm the statewide Brownfield coordinator at the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. I'm excited that we have so many people interested in applying for Brownfield funding. Revitalizing vacant and abandoned properties is one of my passions, and I'm so excited about the Brownfield program because it's a great resource to help facilitate that process. So a little bit about me. I worked as an environmental consultant out in California before moving to New Orleans in 2003. I managed the Brownfield program at the Regional Planning Commission for the New Orleans area for 15 years. And then transitioned over to LDEQ in 2018. When I first started in the Brownfield program here, we had a slew of programs throughout the state, and there was a lot of Brownfield grant money coming in. That kind of over the last 15 years has tapered off. So one of the priorities for me coming in as the new Brownfield coordinator is to really help encourage more communities to apply, support them in their efforts for writing the grant application. And then we're also here for you afterwards to help you implement your program and facilitate the environmental assessment and cleanup of those projects. I've written some successful grant applications. I've also written some unsuccessful grant applications. So we have a lot of lessons learned from that. I'm very excited about applying for the funding. I also found that I would get super excited about applying for the funding. And then when the request for the application actually came out, I'd quickly get very overwhelmed by the amount of information that had to be put together. So one of the things we're going to try to do with this grant writing series is, as best we can, try to break up the application into smaller chunks and help give you some next steps to tackle so it's not as overwhelming all at once. We're also trying to prepare you. Normally, EPA Region 6 has a grant writing workshop once the request for applications comes out. And what we're trying to do with this series is get you ready so that way when the next request for application comes out, you're better able to take advantage of the resources that they offer. Let's see. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop my video right now just to make sure that the sound quality is okay. All right. And then hopefully the slides will advance. There we go. All right, so a few notes before we dive into checking all the boxes in this webinar number 1. We know that these webinars are on the longer side. They're designed to give you a really good foundation to apply for Brownfield funding in the next competition. I'm going to be honest with you, there's no getting around that applying for Brownfield funding takes an investment of both time and energy. But we're hoping these webinars are going to help you focus that time and energy and spread the work of putting together an application over a longer period of time so it's easier to fit into your work schedule. This webinar series, we're going to base it off of last year's request for applications for EPA Brownfield funding. So request for applications, which we'll sometimes say is RFA, that's what EPA sends out to say this is what you need to include when you're asking us for money. The one that comes out in August, it might be a little bit different. We don't expect major changes, but there's always some minor adjustments. Hopefully these webinars are going to help you have those building blocks ready. So when the new RFA comes out, you'll just have to see what the new format is, any little nuances to it, and then be able to put together your application. And remember, as Scott mentioned, KSU has additional webinars that go into more detail about whether or not the Brownfield funding is right for you and how to set up a Brownfield team for a successful program. These webinars are mainly focused on the actual grant application once you've decided to apply for funding. All right, so in today's webinar, we're going to provide a general overview of brownfields and brownfields funding. Then we're going to discuss what the funding can and can't be used for so you can determine if this grant program is a good fit. Then we're going to go into detail about what's required for your organization to actually apply for funding. And then we'll go through the narrative information sheet and the threshold criteria parts of the grant proposal so you can actually get started on the application itself. Basically, today's webinar is just to help make sure you have all the boxes checked so you're ready to apply for funding and you can take care of some of the paperwork part early on. In webinars 2 through 5, that's where we're going to really get into the meat of the application and where the majority of your time and energy is going to be focused. Those are going to be on the narrative proposal. So during those webinars, we'll go over what EPA is asking for in the guidelines, as well as the ranking criteria. And then we're going to talk about what EPA is really asking for and what's between the lines, with tips for how to craft your proposal and pull together the data and information you're going to need for a competitive application. So this webinar, if you've already applied for Brownfield funding in the past, some of it might be a little repetitive, but you definitely want to tune in for webinars 2 through 5. As I mentioned previously, this webinar series is based on last year's request for applications, so it's a good place to start, but there's likely going to be changes next year when it comes out in August. Webinar number 6, which is the last one in the series, we're going to hold that one after EPA issues the new request for applications, and then we're going to highlight any changes that were made so you can retool the work you've done so far to match the current guidelines. All right, so during the webinar, we're going to make suggestions for next steps for you to tackle in order to start on your application. We're going to go over these steps again at the end of the webinar. They're also included in the next steps and helpful links document that I sent out, so you don't have to write them down as we go along. And as Scott mentioned, we're also taping these webinars so you can review them in the future for future reference. Just to make sure, I'm a big one. I don't like using acronyms and people get confused by them. So I just want to make sure, because we're going to use it a lot. Request for applications. Sometimes I'm going to say RFA. That is the document that EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, will send out that details what people need to do to request brownfields funding. Sometimes I might slip up and call it a request for proposals or talk about your proposal. That's what they used to call it up until either last year or the year before. If there are any other terms that you're not familiar with that I use during this presentation, please type those into the chat box so we can make sure that we explain things along the way. All right. So first off, just to make sure we're all on the same page, a brownfield site Basically, it's a vacant or underutilized property where environmental concerns, either they're documented or perceived, inhibit the reuse of a property. So the Brownfields program is an investment of taxpayer dollars designed to support planning, environmental assessment, and cleanup activities to facilitate the reuse of these properties into something that's either going to generate income and tax revenue and jobs, or for community benefits such as a park, community center, library, affordable housing, something like that. So basically it's something that would benefit the community as a whole. That's a pretty wide net. So examples include abandoned gas stations, historic vacant properties that might have lead or asbestos, oddly vacant lots that might have either perceived contamination or a valid reason why they're still vacant, like that vacant lot that you always see on the corner of a major intersection. Good chance that was a gas station at some point. Vacant industrial properties also count. And abandoned houses also fall into this category if they're redeveloped as part of a community-wide initiative or for affordable housing or something that's going to benefit the community as a whole. So often unknown environmental issues and related unknown environmental costs prevent developers from looking at these properties and prevent lenders from providing funding. Those two entities might also have concerns about liability issues. So the Brownfields program helps address both of those issues, both the environmental concerns and liability, to help facilitate the redevelopment of these blighted sites. So the type, EPA provides grant opportunities to facilitate the redevelopment of brownfield sites, including funding for planning, environmental assessments, and cleanup through the assessment, multipurpose, and cleanup grants. So activities conducted with assessment grant funding can include planning activities, such as identifying assets and barriers of a brownfield site, and developing a range of reuse options, and conducting a market study to see what reuses might work well at a site or in a target area. As the name implies, assessment grants also can be used for environmental assessments. They can also be used for developing cleanup plans. So it's pretty much everything up until the point of actually cleaning up the site. In the last competition, the maximum amount for an assessment grant was $300,000. Another option for assessment funding is to apply as an assessment coalition. That's made up of 3 eligible entities that are working together. In last year's competition, the maximum amount for a coalition assessment grant was $600,000. You want to make sure that the entities in the coalition are going to be able to effectively manage the program together, mostly as it relates to procuring an environmental consultant to do the work and selecting sites for the assessments. Different organizations have different requirements. So you just want to make sure that those entities' processes and timelines for those processes will mesh well. You also want to think about who's going to be the prime applicant. This is the entity that EPA will set up the cooperative agreement with and will be legally responsible for the funding. Other coalitions can help with executing the grant. For instance, you can have one coalition member that's in charge of writing the quarterly reports. But EPA holds the prime accountable for execution. So the prime is responsible for actually submitting the quarterly reports to EPA. The prime applicant can also, is the only one who can draw down on the funds from EPA, so they should have a good financial system in place. So now when we're early in the process, it's a really good time if you're thinking about doing a coalition, talking to potential coalition members, and determining if you're going to work well together. At this point, if you're talking with other folks, it might help to have 4 or 5 member options just in case one of those coalition members falls through, or you decide that they might be a better community partner than coalition member. All right, when you apply for assessment funding, you have the option of applying for a community-wide grant to assess multiple sites within one target area. or a site-specific grant to apply for funding for one specific property. So if you apply for a site-specific grant and that site falls through within the time between when you apply for funding and when you get the grant, which is about a year, if it's a site-specific grant, that grant goes away if the site goes away. So really kind of think about if whether or not you want to do site-specific, or if perhaps you want to apply for a community-wide grant, and then you can list that specific site as one of your priority sites. I highly recommend going with the community-wide grant and just having whatever particular site you want to focus on as a priority site. It provides a lot more flexibility, and it's also a lot less work in the application up front. Multi-purpose grants, they allow you to conduct brownfield planning activities, assessment activities, and cleanups all under one grant. It's really a great resource, but the major caveat is that the prime applicant has to own at least one brownfield site in the target area that is eligible for cleanup funding. And the applicant can't be responsible for contamination. So if this is something that you are interested in pursuing, we highly suggest that you contact EPA Region 6 folks early on to tell them about your specific site and who's planning applying for the funding, and make sure that you're going to meet all the eligibility requirements before putting together an application. And previously, the cap on the multi-purpose grants was $800,000, so it is a good amount of funding. EPA also offers cleanup grants, which, as the name implies, are for environmental cleanups at one or more eligible sites that are owned by the applicant. And again, the applicant's not responsible for causing the contamination. As same thing as with the multi-purpose grant, if this is something you're interested in pursuing, we highly recommend you contact EPA early on to make sure that the sites you intend to clean up and who's ever going to apply for the funding are eligible for the cleanup funding before you put in the effort for writing that grant application. Last time, the maximum cleanup grant amount was $500,000. The final category for brownfield in the brownfield funding world is a brownfield cleanup revolving loan fund grant, which provides a pool of funding for the entity to make loans and grants for cleanup projects. So please note the RFA for revolving loan fund grants, it alternates with the multi-purpose grants. So this year is going to be a multi-purpose grant year. That also means if you're looking at the previous request for applications for multi-purpose grants, you'll go back 2 years for that. All right, to make it simple for this grant writing webinar series, we're going to focus on the request for applications for community-wide assessment grants. That's the most popular and normally where new brownfield programs start. Much of the information is transferable to multi-purpose and cleanup grants, but both of those requests for applications have nuances to them. So you want to make sure to review the previous RFAs for reference. And as a reminder, we're using last year's RFA as a starting place. And it'll just need to be updated when the new RFA comes out in August. All right, so your next steps from this slide, decide what funding you're going to apply for. Keep in mind, we're really early in the process, so you can actually change your mind later on if you think, oh, now we've got it all together and we can actually apply for a multi-purpose grant. But now's the time to kind of think that through and decide which one you're going to apply for. If you're going to apply for either cleanup funding with a cleanup grant or a multi-purpose grant, now's a good time to check with EPA to make sure that eligibility boxes are checked. And finally, we encourage you to download a copy of last year's RFA and go ahead and look through it. This is going to be especially useful for webinars 2 through 5 when we get into the narrative proposal. And there's a link to the EPA website with the previous RFAs in the next steps and useful links document. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of a break to do a poll. So Scott, do you want to bring up our poll? Just so that we have an idea of what to cover in the webinar series. We're going to just kind of get a feel for what type of Brownfield grant are you thinking about applying for. You can check all the boxes that apply. If you don't know yet and you're here to learn about the process, that is perfectly okay. We have a checkbox for still deciding or exploring options at the bottom.
We're still receiving some answers. As soon as that stops, I'll go ahead and show the poll results.
All right, looks like we have a good mix of folks. So still a lot of people are either looking for the assessment grant, either with one entity or with a coalition. Ooh, I spelled that wrong, sorry about that. Site specific, all right, we need to talk afterwards. I'm gonna try to convince you to go community-wide. And it's great to see that we're also having someone who's interested in the multi-purpose and cleanup grants. I'd love to see some of those come into Louisiana. I see Kim has a quick question. Are there requirements for who is part of a coalition? We're going to talk about that in the eligibility section. All right, let's see if it'll... All right, Scott, do you want to talk about starting with the Great Project?
Sure. An EPA Brownfields grant should be a tool in your community's redevelopment, not just an isolated source of funding to assess or clean up the site. Before applying for a grant, you need to consider some of these bigger picture items. How will the grant funds positively impact economic development or quality of life in the community? Who will benefit from this redevelopment? And are those people involved with your plans for the grant application? If an EPA grant is not received, is the project worthwhile to pursue with other funding? And are there sources of other funding? You'll address these issues somewhat as you compose the narrative portion of your application, but it's good to keep these things in mind as you begin the process.
All right, thanks, Scott. Let's talk a little bit about target areas and priority sites. So we're going to talk about this more in the next webinar and really get into detail about it. But since the terms come up in the presentation today, we just wanted to kind of give you a general definition. So basically a target area is where you plan on focusing your brownfield activities. It can be a town, a corridor, a neighborhood, a downtown area. It's pretty open-ended for you to define where you want to focus your brownfield funding. So some examples from past application, the towns of Lawrenceburg, Aurora, and Greenville in Indiana, they did a coalition grant where each of those towns was their target area. We partnered with the Port of New Orleans on a corridor along the industrial canal that did a 1-mile buffer on either side of the canal. The Four Corners neighborhood in the city of Lafayette focused on the four corners of a major intersection. In Monroe and West Monroe, they focused on the historic downtowns along the river, along with 3 rural communities in Ouachita Parish. That was another coalition grant. One note, opportunity zones. You're going to hear us say this a lot because it was a priority in the last request for applications, and we're kind of expecting that that's going to be the same again. If you don't know, the opportunity zones are a community development program that was established in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's a federal capital gains tax incentive program, and it's designed to drive long-term investments in low-income communities. So only low-income census tracts were eligible to be designated as opportunity zones. So that's already showing your need for this funding. It also highlights an additional potential resource for for the assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment of brownfield sites. And we're going to talk about leverage resources in the next webinar as well. Louisiana Economic Development has a map of opportunity zones. There's a link to that in the useful links document. That can help you determine if your target area overlaps with an opportunity zone or maybe can be expanded to include one. We just highly recommend you look at that because we, again, expect that to be a priority again. Just so that you know, you can sometimes use the funding that you receive on a site that's outside of your target area, but still within your jurisdiction. But EPA still really wants to see the majority of your funding go to sites within your target area. Obviously, your target area should have several brownfield sites. The number of brownfield sites, it really varies depending on the size of your geographic area and how much funding you're requesting. Some might note they have 15 to 20 sites, some might have 100 or more. Among those sites, you should have kind of 1 to 5 priority sites that you plan to focus on as soon as you get the funding. So EPA really wants to see that you're going to be able to implement the program quickly and start using the grant funds within the first year of the grant period. Again, we're going to go over in more detail what makes for a good target area and priority sites in the next webinar. Just a side note on this though, this is where your brownfield network of developers, real estate folks, and community groups can really help. I found a lot of times as the brownfield program manager, I could write the grant, I could manage the funding, but I sometimes needed help in identifying brownfield sites and coming up with the target areas, especially where there was already some momentum for redevelopment. So if you're in that boat, you might want to reach out to developers, realtors, community groups in the area, other economic agencies who can help you with identifying brownfield sites and with identifying your target areas. Yeah, okay. And again, we're going to cover this more in the next webinar. This slide is just kind of help you familiarize you with some of the terms we're going to use today. All right, as we mentioned before, EPA funding is designed to help address the environmental issues at vacant and abandoned sites to help facilitate their reuse. As with any federal grant program, there are specific things the funding can and can't pay for. So in general, EPA brownfield grant funding can pay for planning activities, such as site reuse assessments, land use assessments, conducting market studies, looking at available and needed infrastructure, conducting community health assessments, and developing a site disposition strategy. We have a link in the useful links document to more information on what's covered underneath EPA's planning activities. And we'll also go over this more in the webinar when we talk about the task descriptions. It can also obviously be used for environmental assessments. If it's a cleanup grant, you can use it for the cleanup. And just keep in mind that for the site, the reuse needs to be either income producing or for a community benefit. Basically, it just can't be used for a single family home. Otherwise, it's a pretty wide net. And even single family homes can count if it's part of a larger affordable housing project. All right, so now that we know what it can be used for, let's talk about what it can't be used for. It can't be used to purchase a site. It also can't be used for the site redevelopment unless it's related to the cleanup. So let's say you're going to put in a parking lot that's also going to cap leaded soil. You know, that could count as part of your cleanup grant, but the rest of the building or whatever other structures you want to put on, those are not eligible for brownfields funding. Also, it can't pay for reimbursement of past activities. When you get the grant, there'll be a project period. Normally it starts October 1st, which corresponds with the federal fiscal year. So any activities that were conducted before then, you can't be reimbursed for unless you work it out to move your project period up with EPA. It also can't pay for if you are the prime applicant, you can't use it on a site where you are the responsible party. So for example, if you are a city and you operated an incinerator at a site and that is now abandoned and you want to redevelop it, the city can't apply for an assessment grant to do assessment work for that site. All right, but notice, added it in a little asterisk. There's always a workaround. The city could work with an economic development nonprofit, other governmental entity, another eligible applicant. They could apply for assessment funding, and then that entity could do the assessment grant underneath that grant. If you have questions on this, let us know and we can kind of walk you through that. All right, as you can guess, with federal funding, there are a lot of caveats and conditions that go along with it. This is just kind of broad brush so you can get a general idea. Your best bet, contact either DEQ, Kansas State, or EPA before the request for application comes out if you have any questions about what's eligible or what's not. That way we can save you some time to make sure whatever you're planning on doing is eligible before you put in the effort of putting together a grant application. All right. Scott, you want to go over the timeline?
Yes, let's talk about the timeline for the grant funding. Normally, EPA issues the request for applications for brownfield funding in October, with the application due in December. This year, however, they're moving up the timeline. The RFA is expected to come out in late August, with the applications due in late October. The bad news is this makes it a little less time to prepare things. The good news being that you don't have to try to do this over the holidays when it's hard to get a hold of resources. We're not sure how this will actually affect the review period by EPA and when they will announce the awards. Normally, they'll announce the grant awards in May or June, but there are rumors they're going to try to move that up also to be ready for the April 2021 National Conference in Oklahoma City. Once the awards are announced, the EPA regional offices, which for Louisiana, that's the EPA office out of Dallas, they'll then work with the people that have received the awards to complete the required cooperative agreement. The grant period for the RFA would then start on October 1st, 2021, which is the start of federal fiscal year 2022. The project period is normally 3 years for assessments and cleanup grants. It would be 5 years for multi-purpose grants. So it's roughly a year between when EPA sends out the request for applications and when the organizations can start spending money. You need to think about your organization during this time frame. Will there be a change in leadership, such as a new mayor or new city council members? If so, be prepared to educate the new administration about the funding. LDEQ can help you with this. Will the person leading the brownfield charge for the community still be around in 12 months? If not, you may want to develop a succession plan. If any major changes occur with key contacts in the application, make sure to let your EPA regional folks know so they can contact the right person if the grant is awarded. In the past, there was a grantee where the mayor and the brownfields coordinator both had changed and EPA didn't have a current contact to go to. It delayed the process somewhat.
All right, thanks, Scott. Now let's go over some of the boxes that you're going to need to check in order to submit your application. So let's talk about who can actually apply for this funding. So government entities, nonprofit organizations, and community development entities can all apply for funding. If you need specific breakdowns on that, on exactly which government entities and the other requirements, if you look on pages 11 and 12 of last year's assessment RFA, or page if you have questions as to whether or not you're eligible, make sure, again, contact EPA Region 6 and they can help you make that determination. If you don't fall in one of those categories, don't fret. So now is a really good time to find a government or nonprofit entity to partner with. If anyone's been involved in brownfield projects, you know these projects don't operate in a vacuum. They do require a lot of partnerships. So eligible entities might be able to manage the program from a funding standpoint, but they need help identifying sites, connecting with developers, and with public outreach, which is where private or otherwise ineligible entities might be able to help. So we're going to cover this more.
Okay, Rebecca, we've kind of lost your sound a little. You're getting glitchy. We do have a question in that's really good here. Trey wanted to know, does LDEQ have its own brownfield inventory that the applicant review and cite in their proposal?
We do not keep an inventory of potential brownfield sites. That was a big push by EPA when brownfields first started. They really needed to document the need for brownfield funding. So they really pushed inventories of potential brownfield sites. There were a couple of issues with that. One was it was very hard and time intensive to maintain that inventory and keep up to date with all the property transfers and the status. The other part was people didn't necessarily appreciate having their sites labeled as brownfields. So we kind of moved away from that. And what I found is most useful is for folks to work with the development community, realtors in their area, their community development organizations, to really see which sites are within their areas. But we'll also, in webinar number 1, we'll go over some other resources that are available and some online databases that you can look through that. And I think there was a question from Kim about the coalition members. So for a coalition grant, each one of the entities needs to fall into one of these categories. They either need to be a government entity, a nonprofit, or a community development entity. Did that answer your question, Kim? I think that should be good. All right, so EPA recently implemented a requirement that current brownfield grantees have to spend down at least 70% of their current assessment funding before applying again. If you fall into this category, just make note when the RFA comes out when that deadline is. Last time it was about a month before the application was actually due. So you just want to make sure you're aware of that deadline. All right, so your next steps from this slide, determine if you're eligible to apply. If not, you might want to look and see if you can be part of another entity's grant and partner with them. And if you're a current grantee, just work on drawing down on your existing grant. All right, Ellen, I see, would the 70% rule apply to the coalition lead? Ah, good question. I'm so glad you asked this. Yes, it only applies to the coalition lead. Okay, this goes in for the inside information that EPA may or may not want us saying, but so the 70% requirement only goes for the coalition lead. If you are the lead on an assessment grant and you haven't spent that down, you can still be part of another coalition as long as you are not the lead for that application. I hope that makes sense. Scott, are there any other questions?
Not that I've seen, no. Folks, just remember to keep putting them in there. We're going to periodically stop and catch those for you.
All right, good questions coming in. All right, so now we're going to go over some of the administrative requirements to make sure that you're going to be able to submit an application. But we're going to start off with a few poll questions just to see where everybody is in this process. So we're going to go over the DUNS numbers, SAM.gov and grants.gov. If you don't know what these are, there's an option for that, but go ahead and fill this out just so we can see where everybody is in this process.
We still have some votes coming in. We'll wait a few more seconds here.
All right. Just FYI, if you are looking on a phone or if you can't see the slides, we did send them out. They were attached to the email that went out with the Zoom meeting info, so you could bring up the slides that way as well. And we are on slide 17, just in case you need to pull it up that way.
And also, as a reminder, the recording of this and the slides will be posted after this event.
Yeah, I have a feeling that the poll questions may not work on the iPad. Someone was asking, the screen is white. So,
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling.
all right. All right, good. Most people have a DUNS number. That's always good. About half are registered and current. That's good. And then most people know if you're registered on grants.gov and who can submit from your application. So that's good that we've got, most folks know how to do this, but we're going to go through the process just to make sure everyone's on the same page, because now is the best time to start and make sure all these boxes are checked. If you have answered yes to all those 4 questions, I'm going to be honest, if you need to go to the bathroom, I would go now and then come back when we go to the slide after this one. If not, let's talk about what you need to do to make sure you're ready to submit your application. All right, so you've decided on what type of grant you're going to apply for. You've made sure your organization is eligible to apply and or put together your coalition. So now we're going to talk about some of the logistics of actually applying for funding to make sure you've checked all the boxes required to actually submit the application. So once your proposal is ready to go, you're going to have to submit it electronically through grants.gov. If you've already submitted an application through grants.gov, you're probably all set as long as that's still current. If you haven't submitted a proposal through that yet, there's basically 3 steps to the process. We're going to go over what's required, and then we're going to provide a link with additional information if your organization needs to complete any of these steps. So first, you're going to need a DUNS number. That's a unique 9-character number that's used to identify your organization that the federal government uses to track how the federal money is allocated. So if you received any federal funding in recent history, your organization probably already has a DUNS number. So just ask your financial folks or other folks that write grants if you don't know this number already, and then just keep it handy for your application paperwork. You can also search the Dun & Bradstreet website and see if they have a number for you. Again, that's in the useful links document. If you need to apply for one, this normally only takes about 2 days. And there's, again, a link on how to do that in the next steps in useful links document. All right, the next step is to register on SAM, which is the federal government system for award management. So it's basically the federal government's way of tracking whether or not your organization is in good standing and is eligible to receive federal funds. So for this, you want to go to www.sam.gov and do a public search to see if your organization is registered. And you also want to make sure that it says that you're in good standing. You do have to do an annual update for your SAM registration. Basically, you just kind of click through everything and say, yes, everything's the same, or no, we need to update this person. So it should note on there when your registration is expiring. You just want to make sure to note that date, and if it's going to need updating before the application is due, to make sure that that's done. If you need to register for a new sam.gov account, note they say that this process can take 2 weeks. That's if everything goes smoothly. It can actually take a lot longer if there are glitches in the system. So if you're not registered already, I really encourage you to start that process soon. I worked with an organization that got a cleanup grant, and it took them several months to get this set up. Basically, the Brownfield person was the one that was completing the online forms, but the confirmation emails went to the executive director's junk mail folder. There was also some issue with the cage code. I still don't really understand. So long story short, you want to start this early if you're not registered already, and make sure that all levels of your organization are involved and aware of the process. EPA can help you through this process if needed. All right, the final step, once you've been registered on sam.gov, the next step is to register on grants.gov. Then you're going to be all set to submit the amazing proposal you're going to write with the help of these webinars. If your organization already has a grants.gov account, this is a really good time for you to find out who your authorized users are. The authorized users are the ones who can actually hit the submit button to submit your proposal from your organization. So for instance, where I was before at the Regional Planning Commission, it was all of, I think we had 20 or 30 people total. I was actually an authorized user and could submit the proposal once my boss reviewed it and said it was okay. You know, now that I'm at the state, it's a much larger institution. There's only a select number of people who are those authorized users, and the process includes at least a week for internal reviews. So now's a good time to figure out who's involved in that submittal process. Give them a heads up that you'll be applying, and just make sure you're aware of any internal timelines to make sure you're getting your proposal and everything they need to submit to them early enough to be able to hit that submit button. Okay, so the next steps from this slide, go through the steps to get through all the way through registering on grants.gov and learn your internal process for applying. Grants.gov, they have an applicant registration section, which is actually really useful. It walks you through each of those steps that we talked about if your organization isn't already set up. So make sure you review that. If you need help with any of these steps, EPA is also available to help. All right, please note, all of these steps are free. So if somebody is asking you for money to do any of these or register, you're on the wrong website. And if we had something where our CFO was asking where I wanted to get the $500 from to register, and I realized he was at sam.com instead of sam.gov. So make sure that if someone's asking you for money, that's the wrong website. All these steps should be free. All right, before we get into the narrative information sheet, are there any questions that came in that we should touch on?
Yeah, we had one. Kim asked about what's the time frame for a SAMS registration to expire? How long does that last?
So if you need to update your sam.gov registration annually. So let's say the last time you went through and checked all the information was March 1st of this year, then you'll need to sometime between now and March 1st of next year, go through, check all the information and update the registration.
So if somebody goes to register right now, it'll be good through the entire application period for this.
Yes. Yep. Okay, Adam had a question. If community-wide grants are flexible, in what situation would a site-specific be preferable to the community-wide? The only instance I can see why you'd want to do a site-specific is if you were an entity and you really only wanted one specific site. That was the only site that you were ever interested in doing brownfields on. And if you didn't have fun, if that site went away, you weren't interested in being in brownfields at all. So that would, a lot of the times that has to do with nonprofit applicants where they are looking maybe to purchase a particular building or redevelop a particular building. And that's the only site that they're interested in developing, and that's the only reason they're involved in brownfields is because of that site. Otherwise, I would recommend just doing the community-wide grant. I think some people have learned the hard way about that. Renewed expiration, okay. Anything else? Any other questions that came in, Scott?
Unless I'm missing some, no.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about, now that we've made sure that your organization is going to be able to actually submit your proposal, let's get started actually writing it. We're going to go over today the narrative information sheet and the threshold criteria document. Okay, I'm going to be honest, we're mostly just demystifying these documents. And these are the two I start with early on, just to get that early sense of accomplishment, and also to make sure you don't forget about them once you get into the writing the narrative part of your application, which will take a lot more effort. Again, the real meat of the proposal, the narrative proposal, we're going to cover in the next 4 webinars, but we want to make sure you take care of these early just so you don't forget about them. All right, so the narrative information sheet is an outline of the basic information about your organization and the proposal. Really don't overthink this, just complete all the sections. This information isn't used in your ranking of your proposal. Basically, it's just a way for EPA to manage the hundreds of applications that they receive, so they have all the relevant information in one place for various reports and press releases, grant fact sheets, that type of thing. Even though it's not used in the ranking criteria, it does kind of create a first impression. So you do want to make sure it's neat, it's organized, and it follows the requirements and the guidelines. In last year's request for applications, the narrative information sheet was limited to 2 single-spaced pages, and it must be on the organization's official letterhead. So just make sure you check those 2 easy boxes. And remember, we're using last year's grant RFA for this walkthrough. So you just want to double check the new guidance when it comes out in August for any changes. And also, if you're applying for a cleanup or multi-purpose grant, be sure to read through those specific requests for applications and make sure you're covering what they're asking for in the narrative information sheet. All right, so now let's go over what you're actually going to include in the narrative information sheet. If you've already downloaded, this is listed on page 28 of last year's assessment grant RFA. I recommend using the numbering system that EPA uses in the RFA, and it makes it easy for them to find the information. I think last year they specifically said use our numbering system. So number 1, first is applicant identification. Basically, you're just going to provide the name and the full address of the entity applying for funds. So who's actually going to receive the grant and be accountable to EPA for the proper expenditure of the funds. All right, let's be honest, this should match up with your letterhead. If you're applying for a coalition grant, this is going to be the prime coalition member. And this is the entity that EPA is going to set up the cooperative agreement with and will be responsible for ensuring the funding is spent correctly. This is also the entity, the only one that's going to be able to draw down on the grant. Second, you're going to tell EPA what kind of funding are you requesting. You're just going to note what type of grant you're applying for. If you're applying for a community-wide assessment grant to cover multiple sites within a target area, or if you're going to apply for a site-specific assessment grant or a coalition assessment grant. Just note last year's request for applications, it didn't really have a specific place to list coalition members. We're going to see if that changes this year. I think when I've applied for a coalition in the past, I might have mentioned it here, but we'll see if that changes for next year. All right, you're also going to state how much you're asking for. And for a site-specific grant, if you're going to request a waiver of the $200,000 limit. If you are applying for a community-wide grant, don't leave number B2 blank. Just say this is not applicable, applying for community-wide funding. Big thing with Brownfield's funding, don't leave anything blank. For complicated reasons, we're not going to really get into. Previous EPA requests for applications required applicants to break out how much funding they were going to use on hazardous sites versus how much funding they were going to use for sites with petroleum contamination. Good news, this is no more. Were able to get rid of that splitting out of funds, so you don't have to worry about this. The grants that were just awarded a week or two ago actually don't have that designation, so it is official, so you don't have to worry about that. All right. Next, you're going to state the location that you propose to serve. You're going to note the city, the parish, and the state. For assessment coalition grants, you're going to list all the jurisdictions that are covered by the coalition members underneath the application. If EPA hasn't changed the format to include a specific line for listing out your coalition members, this might be a good place to list them along with their corresponding jurisdictions. If you're applying for site-specific funding, you'll provide the property name and the complete site address, including the zip code. If you're not applying for site-specific funding, again, don't leave it blank. Just state not applicable, applying for community-wide funding. The narrative sheet also asks for contacts for the project director and the chief executive highest ranking elected official. Your project director, that's the main point of contact for the project. That's the one that's responsible for the day-to-day operations. The project director might also be contacted if other information is needed. So it's helpful to make sure that this person is going to be around for the next year in case EPA has questions on the application and to complete the grant paperwork if they're actually selected for funding. If your organization is a municipal form of government, that chief executive highest ranking elected official would be the mayor or the parish president. For other entities, it might be the executive director or the president. So basically, it's who can sign contracts for your organization. You're also going to note the population of your jurisdiction on the narrative information sheet. If you're a city or a town, just provide the population of that geographic area. If you're a parish or a regional organization that covers a geographic area with more than one city or town, you want to provide the population of the city or town in which each priority site and target area is located. If you're a nonprofit organization or community development entity, again, provide the population of the city or town in which the projects are located. And if you are a tribe, then you want to provide the number of tribal or non-tribal members that are affected. If you have multiple target areas, or if you're part of a coalition, you might consider just putting a table together for this just to make sure it's clearly delineated what the populations are. All right, Scott, do you want to go over the other factors checklist?
Sure, thanks, Rebecca. The 7th item on last year's narrative information sheet was the other factors checklist. There's a rumor this may be removed from this coming year's RFA, but for now, we'll prepare as if it'll be there still. The factors on this list change from year to year based on EPA's priorities at the time. Last year, the checklist included community size, mines carved lands, and whether your priority site is adjacent to a body of water or in a floodplain. Because this checklist will likely change, please be sure to carefully read the instructions in the next RFA. It's important also to correctly reference the page numbers in your narrative where the factor is discussed. As you compose and edit the narrative portion of your application and page numbers change, please be careful to keep this reference accurate. The information you include in the other factors checklist will not increase your score as EPA evaluates your application. However, EPA may consider these factors as tiebreakers between applications with the same score. This is not a trivial thing as the competition is very close. A lot of good applications have the same scores. EPA often must consider ways to break scoring ties to determine which applicants actually receive the grants.
All right, thanks, Scott. All right, finally, you're going to need to attach a letter from LDEQ stating that we know that you're applying for the funding. I recommend stating in the narrative sheet that the letter is attached. That way, if for some reason it gets lost, then EPA knows that you didn't forget about it. So for Louisiana folks, you're going to send an email to me at rebecca.audi@la.gov and say, we're applying for funding. We would like a support letter. I'm going to reply back to you and with an email that's going to ask you for who the letter should be addressed to, what type of grant you're applying for, how much you're applying for, the name of your target area, and whether it's just you or if you're applying for a coalition grant, and the names of your coalition members. That information just helps me know who to address the letter to and then kind of customize the letter for your grant. We typically say how excited we are to be partnering with you on this and what a great application it is. So we want to kind of include some details in the letter to help with that. Don't send this right away. Wait until the request for application comes out to actually request the letter. That way, just in case EPA asks us to include something specific this year, we can make sure to do that. But once the RFA is issued, go ahead and send me the email right away. You don't have to have your application written in order to request the letter. This just helps you make sure it gets back to you in plenty of time and you don't forget about it until the last minute. And normally I turn them around in about 5 days. So it normally just takes me roughly a week to get that back to you. All right, so that's the information that's in the narrative information sheet. Again, this part is a very easy box to check. So just look through last year's RFA, draft your narrative information sheet, highlight sections you don't have information just yet, so you can remind yourself to fill them in later on. All right, so here's an example of a narrative information sheet. Note that the application used to require that the cover letter, sorry about that. So applications used to require a cover letter where folks would include more information up front in paragraph format. That's not necessarily required, but some people are still in the habit of it. So that's why it's in this cover letter narrative sheet. Notice that it is on their letterhead and that they use the numbering system in order to include all the information, including put in a table for the contact information, and then noted the page numbers and the other factors checklist. So just make sure it's neat, it's organized, and has all the required information with the numbering system. All right, so we're going to take a pause for questions.
All right, I missed one before.
Oh.
Ray had a question. If you want to apply for a cleanup grant and have an existing assessment grant, does the 70% drawdown still apply, or is that just for another assessment grant?
That is one I'm going to have to double check with the cleanup grant RFA to see what the specific requirements are. My understanding, if I remember correctly, is that it only applies with the assessment grants. But we'll have to double check to get back to you with a definitive answer.
I did a little looking. I pulled it up, just very quick review. I couldn't find that as one of the criteria on the cleanup. I've got the guidelines pulled up on the side here, and I did not see that. But again, we'll look it up and make sure that's the right answer there.
Okay. Oh, Trey. The last item on the other factors says 30% or more can go towards the planning activities. I'm going to be honest with you, there's a little bit of debate on this. Although it says in the other factors checklist, it gives the appearance that it's good to have that much dedicated towards planning activities. When you actually get into the narrative part and the ranking of your proposal with your budget, they want to see, the reviewers really want to see the majority of the funding going towards assessments. I think what they don't want is just a lot of overhead, but if you do have planning activities, I would include those in. It's always good to show how you're partnering this funding together. But we're going to wait for the next RFA to come out to see if they've given a little bit more guidance on that as far as that 30% level. All right, any other questions? All right. All right, the next part of the application we're going to talk about is the threshold criteria. Basically, this information is just to make sure your organization is eligible to apply for the funding. So EPA evaluates this part just on a pass-fail basis. It doesn't factor into your points or the ranking of your proposal. So basically, you just need to answer each of the questions. This should be, a standalone page of your application, so all the responses are together in one place. So first up, applicant eligibility. Basically, you're just going to state how you fall into one of the categories that's eligible to apply for funding. So if you're a city, a parish, make sure to say you're a county, so explain parish as county. Or if you're a tribe or a state, you're just going to say that you're applying as one of those entities. If you're a government entity other than that, just explain what kind of government entity you are and attach documentation of that. So for example, you're enabling legislation or a local government resolution that created your entity. If you're a nonprofit organization, an organization that's comprised of nonprofit entities, or a qualified community development entity, you're going to state which one of those you are, and then attach documentation of your eligibility. So for example, for nonprofits, you would want to provide documentation demonstrating your 501c3 status. If you're applying as a coalition, you want to state how each coalition member is eligible and attach the applicable documentation. Coalition members must also submit a signed letter addressed to the grant applicant, the lead coalition member, in which they agree to be part of the coalition. Or you can attach an active memorandum of agreement if you have one of those in place already. That includes a description and role of each coalition member. So basically, you just need to attach documentation. All your coalition members are actually on board with this plan. If you have any questions about what to attach to document your eligibility, definitely contact EPA. They can review your documentation before you submit it and tell you if it's adequate. The second threshold criteria is community involvement. Basically, you just want to talk about your plan to inform and involve the community and other stakeholders in the brownfield activities that you're describing in your application. There is a section in the narrative proposal where you're going to describe your community involvement efforts in more detail. I have been known to just copy and paste that whole section here, or you can just give a brief overview of those activities. Keep in mind that for this document, it's just the threshold criteria, which is pass-fail. So basically, if you've stated something that sounds reasonable, you have a pretty good chance of passing. Also, this threshold criteria document is reviewed by EPA Region 6, which is our local brownfield folks. They have the option of contacting you if they have any questions or need more information. So, make sure you answer the question, state all of the community involvement you're going to do, but I wouldn't spend too much time wordsmithing it here in the threshold criteria answer. Save that energy for the description you're going to do in the narrative proposal. The third threshold criteria is expenditure of assessment grant funds. Again, if the main applicant currently has an EPA Brownfield assessment grant, this is where you're going to state that you've drawn down at least 70% of your grant funding, and you're going to attach documentation. Again, for coalitions, this only applies to the main applicant. If you don't have a Brownfield assessment grant, just state that here. Again, never leave anything blank. And so With those three criteria, if you are applying for a coalition or community-wide assessment grant, you are all done with threshold criteria. Ta-da! That's it. Pretty easy to check those boxes. If you are requesting site-specific funding, you're going to need to include the additional threshold criteria for site-specific applications. Pretty extensive. It's basically to make sure that the site and the applicant are both eligible for cleanup funding. In last year's RFA, it took up about 10 pages in the RFA document of additional information that you needed to apply or include. So my suggestion, again, unless you have a really compelling case for applying for a site-specific grant, apply for a community-wide assessment grant, and then just list the site that you want to focus on as one of your priority sites. All right, so the next step from this slide, just draft your threshold criteria document, including the attachments and the site-specific threshold criteria if you want to go in that direction. Also, another reminder, this is based on last year's guidance. So this is going to help you get a jump start on that paperwork so you can concentrate on the actual proposal that will be ranked. But you might need to tweak these documents just to conform to the new RFA once it's issued. All right, so here's an example of the threshold documentation document and the coalition member letter. What I liked about this, the way that they did this, is that they also attached some header sheets just to make sure everything was nice and organized and it was easy for the reviewer to find all the information. So this is, note that they have the headers here for each of the threshold criteria. They say they don't have an active assessment grant. And then this is an example of the letter that says that we are on board with this plan of being in this coalition. All right, another pause for questions. Anything else come in, Scott, that we need to?
Not that I've noticed. I do have one thing to mention. Rebecca, you mentioned this also. I want to emphasize a little bit. EPA is kind of the sole entity that's going to determine if you meet eligibility. LDEQ, KSU tab can advise on this, but EPA Region 6 is the go-to for all eligibility determinations if you have to have the exact answer, yes or no. They're willing to help with this, and they're available and happy to make sure that everybody gets the right information attached to meet eligibility.
All right. Thanks, Scott. Okay. One of the things that I found really helpful in learning how to tell my story and really craft my proposal was looking at successful applications from past competitions. So KSU tab has example applications that were successful in the past. They're posted on their website. Great ideas for content, format, and just kind of get a general feel for how to frame your proposal. So Scott's going to show you later on how to find these, but just keep these in mind. Really encourage you to look at these and get a good idea of what you might want to include in your proposal. The next step from this slide, just review one example for a proposal from, or application I should say, from one of the past competitions in the category that you're thinking about applying for. All right, so those are basically the boxes that need to get checked to get ready to submit your application. So let's recap the next steps from this webinar to help get you going. So first, determine if your organization is ready to take on a Brownfield grant and is eligible to apply. Then you want to determine what funding type you're planning on applying for. And again, we're very early in this process, so you can change your mind later on. That's okay. Check and make sure that you know what your DUNS number is. You're registered on sam.gov and it's current. And you're registered on grants.gov and know what your internal process is. Download the previous request for applications and just look through it for whatever grant you're planning on applying for. Review one example proposal from the past successful applications, and then start drafting your narrative information sheet and your threshold criteria documents, and then contact EPA for any questions about eligibility documentation. And if you're a current grantee, make sure to be drawn down on that existing grant. All right, so looking ahead for the next webinar, that's when we're going to get into the meat of the application and the first part of the narrative proposal, which is project area description and plans for revitalization. That's coming up next week on Thursday, same time. So you just want to think about what are some of your community's brownfield sites that if those are improved, they could help revitalize the community environmentally, economically, socially, like what are some of those priority sites? And then also kind of start thinking about what makes your community unique. I think in one brownfield application I saw somewhere where they were the buggy capital of Louisiana. I liked that one. Another one had the first Coca-Cola bottling plant as one of their priority sites. So start thinking along those lines for when we talk about the project area description and plans for revitalization next week.